Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this unusual AGU, and thank you for being interested enough to click on our virtual presentation to see all the details. So I'm going to talk today a bit about carbon cycle feedback uncertainties in both future concentration and warming projections. This comes out of some work I did with Richard Betts in an analysis we published on Carbon Brief earlier this year, and we're working with both Ben Booth and Pierre Friedlingstein to turn this into a more detailed peer-reviewed paper at the moment. But I want to give you guys a sneak peek of our results and a bit about how we're approaching the problem. So first of all, there's a number of limitations of the concentration-driven scenarios that are, primarily done in the context of the CMIP process. These are the scenarios that are featured in the IPCC Summary for Policymakers. They're the ones that are used by much of the impacts literature, and obviously is by various state and local adaptation planners. Now, the reason why fixed concentration rather than emission scenarios are used in scenario MIP is that not all of the models participating in either CMIP 5 or CMIP 6, for that matter, are Earth system models with biogeochemistry. A distinct subset, about half of the models in CMIP 5, for example, don't have a dynamic carbon cycle, and therefore they're actually not able to directly translate an emission pathway to a concentration pathway within the model. So instead, what we do is we provide a single set of concentrations for all the models to use, and a single set of forcings for that matter across various other aspects, based on a single best estimate of carbon cycle feedbacks that's largely derived from the prior C4 MIP experiment, which is an emission-driven run that was done in the prior IPCC. So for example, CMIP 5 concentrations are derived using CMIP 3 C4 MIP results. And why this is a problem is that while it includes a single best estimate of carbon cycle feedbacks, that albeit a little dated one, it misses large uncertainties across the models that are highly relevant for future warming outcomes. There are uncertainties, large enough uncertainties in carbon cycle feedbacks that when included, you get a much wider range of warming than you otherwise would if you just used fixed concentration scenarios. And these really should be taken into account in a lot of our assessments. Now, the challenge, however, is there's very limited runs of C4 MIP currently available. In CMIP 5, the C4 MIP experiments, the emission-driven Earth system model experiments, were only done using 12 models and only a single future emission scenario, RCP 8.5. There is another set of experiments done using the HADS-CM3 model that was a perturbed physics ensemble as well that provides a set of estimates. But again, that was only run for RCP 0.5, RCP 2.6, and the old A1B scenario. The difference between these two sets of experiments, C4 MIP and the HADS-CM3 PPE, is essentially C4 MIP is an ensemble of opportunity. Every Earth system model tries to select the single best parameterization to get the carbon cycle right in that model. Whereas the PPE, the perturbed physics ensemble, lets us more fully explore the parameter space, but limited to a single model, HADS-CM3. Note that the PPE experiments, which were done by Ben Booth, had an additional constraint where they only limited sets of parameters that effectively reproduced historical CO2 concentrations. So ones that were too far off the historical CO2 concentration trajectory were discarded. And so the results that are shown in this figure for the PPE include only those that are consistent with historical concentrations. And so what this figure shows is the actual results for C4 MIP and the perturbed physics ensemble for RCP 0.5. Here, the bars are the range across all of the concentration estimates. The black solid line that goes across the middle is the sort of prescribed concentration for RCP 0.5 that's used in scenario MIP experiments. And then the dots is every single different estimate from C4 MIP and from the perturbed physics ensemble, respectively. We also have perturbed physics ensemble results for RCP 2.6 that are shown in the leftmost column. However, for the rest of these scenarios, there is no actual specific model runs that we can draw on. There were no RCP 4.5, RCP 6, et cetera, simulations in either the C4 MIP or the perturbed physics ensemble. And so what we wanted to do is essentially create a way to fill in the gaps, to look at some of these other scenarios outside of RCP 0.5 that might be relevant to policymakers and others, and figure out a way to estimate the range of carbon cycle feedback uncertainties in each of these scenarios. And the way we approached that was to essentially take RCP 8.5 as a starting point and look at in which year in RCP 8.5 concentrations reach the prescribed values in the other RCPs. So for example, RCP 6.0 gets to about 650 parts per million CO2 by 2100. RCP 0.5 gets to about 650 parts per million CO2 in the year 2067. And so if we take those RCP 0.5 runs for both the Perturbed Physics Ensemble and C4MIP and sample them in the year 2067, we can get a spread of carbon cycle feedback values expressed in atmospheric concentrations of CO2 that are roughly representative of what we'd expect in RCP 6.0 in the year 2100. We do a similar approach for RCP 4.5, whose 2100 concentrations happen in the year 2050 in the RCP 8.5 runs, and RCP 2.6. So in that scenario, the Perturbed Physics Ensemble actually has RCP 2.6 results directly, and so we use those. We only estimate RCP 2.6 from the 8.5 runs in the C4MIP experiments. There's a couple interesting things to note in this analysis. First is that there's a very wide range of carbon cycle feedbacks here, that can fairly dramatically increase atmospheric CO2, particularly in the high emission scenarios, relative to the prescribed concentrations. A second thing to note is the prescribed concentrations are actually a little bit lower than the mean of these estimates, particularly in the Perturbed Physics Ensemble, but also in C4MIP. And this reflects the fact that the CMIP5 C4MIP experiments tended to have slightly higher carbon cycle feedbacks on average than those in CMIP3, which were used as the basis to derive the fixed concentration estimates. A final thing to note here is that, in the highest carbon cycle feedback estimate in RCP6, we see about 936 parts per million in 2100, which is actually roughly equivalent to the prescribed CO2 concentrations in the RCP 8.5 scenario. And why this is relevant is, there's been a lot of literature recently critiquing the RCP 8.5 emissions trajectory as, increasingly unrealistic. And even if you take that as a granted, you still can't necessarily rule out RCP 8.5 level forcings if carbon cycle feedbacks end up being on the high side. Now, it would require the single most extreme estimate to get for RCP 6 emissions to give you RCP 8.5 concentrations. But you could certainly see, scenarios between those two, say the new SSP3 7.0 scenario, reaching 8.5 watts per meter squared forcing if carbon cycle feedbacks are on the higher end. So we certainly can't rule out those levels of forcing due to this uncertainty in carbon cycle feedbacks. Here's another way of looking at the same data. Here, instead of showing the absolute concentrations in the year 2100, I'm showing the change in atmospheric CO2 relative to the fixed concentration scenarios for each of the RCPs. So, in RCP 8.5, in the C4MIP experiments, we have anywhere from 142 parts per million lower to 213 parts per million higher CO2 in 2100. Similarly, it's 84 parts per million lower to 660 parts per million higher in the PPE. And similar values, albeit smaller, for the rest of the concentration scenarios. Now, one of the challenges with this approach is because we only have real data for RCP 8.5 and 2.6 in the case of the PPE, we are, don't have any great way to evaluate how effective our intermediate estimates are. One way we can try to approach this is to essentially use the same approach on different scenarios. So as I mentioned earlier, in addition to RCP 8.5, we also have the A1B scenario in the Perturbed Physics Ensemble. And so this plot just shows the results you get from the same method. So, picking the year in which the scenario reaches, say, RCP6 2100 concentrations, CO2 concentrations, and looking at the spread of carbon cycle feedbacks in that year in that scenario, applied to both the A1B scenario and the RCP 8.5 scenario. So the first two bars show the RCP6 results in A1B and RCP6 results in the 8.5 scenario. Second two are for 4.5. And the last three are, RCP 2.6 based on A1B, RCP 8.5, or sorry, RCP 2.6 based on RCP 8.5, and the actual RCP 2.6 results from the Perturbed Physics Ensemble, which are reasonably consistent, which is actually a little surprising in some ways, because this is a very extreme, scenario. You're essentially sampling RCP 8.5 or the A1B scenario in the late 2020s, which is when they reach 2100 RCP 2.6 levels. But you do get a carbon cycle feedback spread not that inconsistent with the actual RCP 2.6 values in the Perturbed Physics Ensemble. So that's encouraging. And so we have estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks for each of the RCPs, and now we want to translate them into uncertainty in the warming outcomes. And so the way we approached that was to essentially take all of the CMIP5 model runs individually and perturb each of the CMIP5 models based on all of the estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks in both the C4MIP experiments and the perturbed physics ensemble experiments. And the way we calculate the change in 2100 warming is essentially by taking the transient climate response of each of the models and seeing what that would the additional reduction of atmospheric CO2 for each of these carbon cycle feedback estimates would entail given the model's transient climate response. So it's a fairly simple approach. And this shows the results in this figure. The first bar is the results for CMIP5, sort of bog standard with no perturbation of atmospheric CO2. So these are sort of the standard CMIP5 results. The second bar is using all the carbon cycle feedback estimates in C4MIP. So essentially taking each of the CMIP5 models, perturbing it by all the different estimates in C4MIP of carbon cycle feedbacks, and basing the resulting warming on the transient climate response of the model. And the third bar is doing the same, but for the perturbed physics ensemble estimates. And you see there's a fairly significant widening of uncertainty here in future warming, particularly in the high emission scenarios. In CMIP5, RCP.5 give you anywhere between 3.3 and 6 degrees warming, but across the estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks, it's anywhere from 2.9 degrees to 7.7 degrees warming. And even in some of the intermediate scenarios, you can't rule out warming of around 4 degrees in an RCP 4.5 scenario at the high end of carbon cycle feedback estimates in the literature. And so this is an important finding and something we should really be taking into account when discussing these future scenarios to actually include the uncertainties of carbon cycle feedback in our warming outcomes. Now, the transient climate response approach is not necessarily the perfect approach. In reality, it would be nice to be able to rerun each of the CMIP5 models with a different set of concentrations based on all of these carbon cycle feedback results. We can't do that in practice, of course, but we're also looking into other ways of creating emulators for the models that might be a little more precise than just using the model transient climate response to estimate the effect of the additional CO2. But one way to test our approach, our transient climate response approach, is to actually compare it to the results of C4MIP, because obviously the 12 models that participated in C4MIP actually have 2100 warming values. And so what this plot shows is for those 12 models, the fixed concentration warming in RCP 8.5. So what happens in those 12 models that participated in the C4MIP experiment if you look at their fixed concentration runs, so you don't have a dynamic carbon cycle. Here's what happens if you look at the C4MIP results for those 12 models. So you do have a dynamic carbon cycle and you're running the models based on emissions rather than concentrations. And then finally, the range of warming you get if you take those 12 models, use their transient climate response and all of the different estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks in C4MIP to try to derive end of century warming. And there are some differences here. They're not exactly the same, and those are important differences to take into account. But it does capture much of the additional uncertainty in warming, this sort of transient climate response approach. Another way of looking at the same results are to essentially plot the 2100 warming in each of the 12 C4MIP models, or C4MIP participating models, both based on the C4MIP approach and the transient climate response approach. And there certainly is some variation here. Some of this is also just due to internal variability in the models, right? You do another run of the same model, you're going to get slightly different outcomes because of internal variability. And some of these results are probably due to that. HADGEM2, for example, has higher CO2 concentrations in the C4MIP experiments, but lower warming than the fixed concentration experiments, which is a little odd and probably due down to that. So, we think this is an important approach to sort of try to take into account the uncertainty in carbon cycle feedbacks and future warming outcomes. And we also want to look at what this implies for sort of likely current policy trajectories. So this plot shows the likely range of CO2 concentrations given IEA scenarios, so the sort of current and stated policy scenarios that the International Energy Agency publishes regularly, extrapolated out through 2100. But as I mentioned, there are sort of wide carbon cycle feedbacks here. So, even though the high end of sort of current policy scenarios is somewhere around RCP6, we can't necessarily fully rule out concentrations close to RCP 0.5 if carbon cycle feedbacks are on sort of the high end of the literature. And similarly, it could be a little lower as well. Here's a similar example for the warming outcomes in CMIP5. This is sort of the range of warming you'd get using the IEA current policy scenarios. And again, feedbacks could make that much higher or much lower. And so, with that, I think I'm out of time, but thanks everyone. And you can find my contact info below. I'm happy to answer any questions about these results and look forward to having it in print later sometime next year.